Hello and welcome to The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course dedicated to the art of conversation. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media and Journalism at Commonwealth University here in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. This show is the official radio presence of Honors 211, The Art of Conversation, a course that focuses on the ancient art of dialectic. That is, the collaborative process by which knowledgeable peers pursue the truth through focused question and answer, back and forth, what is often called Socratic discussion. After a few weeks of wading through the theory on these matters, our students spend about 10 weeks in practice, holding twice-weekly 75-minute deep dives into topics and questions of their choosing. Our theme this semester is the good life in the Great Acceleration, and all of our content falls somewhere within this intentionally wide umbrella. Each week, we're talking about how to live good lives in this era of soaring economic growth, technological innovation, labor market uncertainty, political turbulence, climate change, mass extinction, and on and on and on. My guests today are Aidan and Taylor, a pair of student moderators who this week asked our class to weigh in on the matter of whether art should ever be censored. We talked it over in class last week, and today we'll try to distill that long and winding conversation into 30 minutes of relative clarity. Aidan and Taylor, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Let's start off by getting to know you just a little bit. Maybe tell us who you are, where you're from, what's your major, what prompted your interest in art censorship?
My name's Aidan. I'm from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I guess I just wanted to talk about art censorship because I just have an interest in art and whether or not people should view it and how important it is to us as people.
I'm Taylor. I'm a student at Bloomsburg and I'm studying psychology. And art is important to me because I think that it increases the diversity of thought of our students and our society.
Great. Well, let's start with some definitional questions and we'll focus here on our two key terms. For starters, in your mind, what is art?
In the discussion, I said it's like very liberal. It could be basically anything that people use their creativity and they like express it onto something. But I feel like a lot of people see some things as art and other things not as art. What one person sees as art, it may not be the same as someone else.
I think that art is anything that can be created and expressed into the world.
So you mentioned art as being particular to human beings, like artifice, the artificial creation of humans, something not appearing in nature. What happens if, they give a chimpanzee a paintbrush and he creates something on a canvas, or some other animal is given implements to make something? Does that qualify as art in your mind, or does it have to originate with a person?
I don't think that it has to originate from a person. I think that that's an interesting thought. I think it also kind of correlates with artificial intelligence art. Should that be considered art?
I was gonna say, if you gave a monkey anything, it'd do something with it. So, I mean, again, I think some people may see it as art, but I wouldn't consider it art personally.
Last semester, I had a student who assigned us an article to read about an art competition in which somebody had entered a painting that was then disclosed to be the work of an AI generator. And so there was this big sort of controversy around this, should art that is generated by AI be eligible for entry into these competitions? Does it still count as art if it was created by a computer program instead of a human being? I mean, what do you think? Would you include it?
I kind of touched on this in the class, but I think it's interesting how someone could program that and create it to find all that stuff and create an art piece, but I wouldn't consider the piece itself art, rather the programming used to create it. Because it's kind of like if you make a video game, let's say, I think that's display of talent, and I think that goes the same way that programming something to create something else is kind of a display of talent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would have to agree. but I would not include AI in art competitions. I think that as a society we can use AI and we can benefit from that, but in terms of competition, I think that, like Aidan said, it would more focus on the programming and not the actual art itself.
So the person who creates artificial intelligence is an artist, but the artificial intelligence creating art is not.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
All right. I think that's easy enough to process. Let's talk then a little bit about censorship. Can you give us a definition for censorship and what you mean when you use that term?
When I use it, I'm thinking of anything that some higher power would block out or not allow. It's like...
You mean God?
No. I mean a higher power like the government or like the dean of students, let's say. Anything that they wouldn't allow their followers, I guess, to see.
When someone in like a position of authority doesn't want everyone else to have access to information, so they withhold it somehow.
Yeah, and I think that that can be a broad variety of things. Like Aidan said, it can be the dean restricting students from seeing that, or museums restricting visitors to seeing that, or the government regulating our media. So I think it can be a multitude of things that censorship can apply to.
I mean, we can get into this in more granular detail as we go, but I think there are also gradations of this that are worth considering. So to qualify as censorship, does the information, the artwork, whatever it is, have to be totally removed and inaccessible? Or what if instead you place a rating on it or a restriction that some people can access it but others can't, based on their age or on their level of seniority in an organization or something? Is a more moderate restriction a form of censorship also, or does it have to be completely blocked in order to say that it was censored?
I think that we talked about in class the difference between regulation and censorship, and I think that there's a fine line between them, but I think that when there's age restrictions and seniority, I think that that's more of a regulation and kind of like a safe, secure of information instead of just totally wiping it out. I would have to say that censorship is kind of just like blacking it out and taking it away.
I was gonna say, I think it's like hard to determine who decides what gets blocked because everyone has differing opinions. And I do think there is a difference between censorship and regulation, but what applies under what is kind of hard to determine.
But maybe in just speaking broadly here, the example that came up in class was how in China, any mention of the events in Tiananmen Square get blocked. If you mention it on Chinese social media, Red Note, I think, is the one that was mentioned, like it will disappear, it will be removed. It's not allowed to appear on their television. So in that sense, that those references are censored. Whereas, in the United States, if, say, somebody made a movie about Tiananmen Square and it was a violent movie that got an R rating, so people under 17 weren't allowed to see it, that wouldn't qualify as censorship in the same way, more like a regulation. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then when you chose this topic about art censorship, what art typically gets censored that inspired you to look at this?
I was thinking stuff like Animal Farm in like 1984 and Fahrenheit 451.
So you have book bans in mind in particular.
Yeah.
I would have to agree that book bannings come to mind, but I think that it's also important to note that Aidan and I kind of referred to art as like media forms, and I think that that can be like book banning, taking paintings down in museums, and then we kind of dived into social media in class and government regulation of media.
I think the type of art is worth dwelling on for a moment, because we opened the class by asking everyone, when you think of art, what do you think of? And do you think it is important enough that if someone were to block access to it, that would constitute a real violation of their rights? And it was kind of a mixed bag, and some people seemed to think that art was important. Others seemed to think that it wasn't important at all, and so it didn't matter if it got censored. And then when we asked people, well, what type of art comes to mind when you think of art? Some people were thinking about music. Some people were thinking about film. Some people were thinking about how we're in like the golden age of television, where you have all these really, really high quality streaming programs, for example. And then, of course, visual art of various kinds as well. And the book example, I think, is very prominent, but it seemed like people had different associations where art is concerned, and they were taking that in different directions.
I know that you talked a little bit ago about how like some people found it important and some people did not. And to those people, I would say I think that art is throughout our whole world, and I think that it has an influence on our students, on our children, on the types of things that you digest, music and film. And it also has religious aspects. I know in class there was a student who kind of said that he didn't really care about art like that. And then I used the example, well, if someone is attacking your religious beliefs, you would care about that then. And I think that people just kind of don't care until it affects them, but I think it's important to care even when it doesn't affect you.
You had given us a YouTube video to watch in which, I guess it was a TEDx talk somewhere. And the guy was talking about a Goya painting in Spain from many years ago during, in fact, the Spanish Inquisition. And it was called the something Desnudo. It was a painting of a nude woman laying on a couch. And then later he also had to do a version of the painting in which she was clothed. Right, it was basically the same painting, just one she's naked, one she's not. And he was using this as an example of a great artist producing a great work that placed him in some danger because it was viewed as immoral or something. And that seems to be a pretty good example, I think, of what you're talking about. In the Spanish Inquisition, for example, producing a work of art like that could place the artist in real danger and certainly have the work blocked or destroyed or burned, that sort of thing. Do you get the sense that that danger still exists? I mean, do artists still work under threat in the 21st century?
I would have to say no. I think that it's important to note that artists have come so far in the freedom of expression, and I think that that's important to maintain. I know that if something would happen to make artists feel as though they are under threat, I feel like that's a really bad thing to happen to us as a society. I think that just like freedom of speech, it's important to have freedom of expression through media forms, like we talked about, and a multitude of things, because, that's what makes us who we are.
Drawing on this example of the painter who paints the nude woman and then faces the censors in the Inquisition, it seems to me that things like nudity and sexuality are much more likely to face the censors in our day and age than other things. I mean, we have a concern about violence, for example, in TV shows and movies and things like that, but references to sexuality or depictions of human nudity are much more likely, I think, to get books removed from libraries or to get restrictions placed on TV shows and films. You get a TV MA rating or an R or an NC-17 rating. And culturally, I guess as a people, Americans seem somewhat squeamish about that sort of thing, especially when it is made accessible to teenagers or kids. Maybe one area in which the question of art censorship starts to become more salient is the question of, at what point do depictions of nudity or frank discussions of sexuality stop being artistic or stop being legitimate forms of expression and enter into the realm of the obscene or the pornographic, because that stuff still gets restrictions in a way that other forms of art maybe don't. And of course, a lot of art dating back forever concerns the human form. Do you think that there is a clean distinction between art and pornography? If so, like, where is that line drawn?
I think that's up to the person to determine, different for each individual. You could say porn is a type of filmography, so you could just put that under the same umbrella as like film as an art form and how people just do that to express themselves.
I think that that's kind of a gray line. We don't really know the distinction yet. It's an interesting topic.
I mean, to a degree, it might be in the eye of the beholder. Take, for example, the 1998, 1999 film Titanic with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. There's a scene in that in which DiCaprio's character, who is a talented artist, is drawing a picture of Winslet, who is posing nude. Is that pornography? Is that art? I could see people taking either perspective on the matter. What perspective do you take?
I think you could classify it as both. It's the human body and all of us have it. So what differentiates that from, let's say, a picture of an anatomy photo in like a textbook?
I don't believe that nude paintings should be considered pornographic. I think that would be an art form for me. We kind of dealt with this in class. We all have the human body and it should be represented. I just don't believe that that's pornographic to the point where it should be censored.
It's tough to say for sure. I brought this up in class, but I couldn't remember the citation. I have it here. It was 1964. United States Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart described his threshold test for obscenity in Jacob Ellis v. Ohio by stating that while he could not define pornography, quote, "I know it when I see it," which is not that helpful from a legal or an ethical standpoint. And so for some people, any depiction of human nudity or any discussion of sexual activity between people might constitute the pornographic, or they might argue that it's pornographic and should therefore be restricted. And other people might have a much more generous definition of art, to say that even things that are widely agreed upon to be obscene or to be pornographic should be considered art. You guys just don't get it, or something. You know what I mean? And that raises, I think, an interesting sort of problem that has a history that goes back at least as far as Goya and the Inquisition.
Could I add something?
Please do.
I think that going back to book banning, for example, with students, in class we talked about sexual orientation and books that have LGBTQ topics, relationships. I think that schools that are banning books just because there's two fathers or two mothers or male and male relationship or anything on that spectrum, I think that it's a tough discussion to be had because, people kind of say quote, the gay agenda, but I don't really think that that's pushing anything on students, and I would strongly argue against that students of that age should be able to recognize that two men or two women, or that they should be able to be in a relationship, and that should kind of be normalized. Not kind of, it should be normalized, because we're trying to make progress in our society, and I think that banning books just because, they have gay relationships, I think that that's a dangerous state to be in.
Now, I've looked into this a bit. I've written a little bit about book banning, and in particular the group Moms for Liberty. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they're active in the United States and behind a lot of initiatives to remove books from libraries and from school curricula because they are allegedly pornographic. And one of the big ones is this graphic novel by Maya Kobabe, Genderqueer. Have you encountered this book at all? It's basically a memoir about their experience growing up with a certain degree of gender confusion as an adolescent and trying to work through those difficult years. And because it talks pretty frankly about LGBTQ issues, and because it's a graphic novel that features illustrations, it is on the top 10 list of most banned books in the United States in recent years. And so I think it falls very cleanly within the topic that you're concerned with here. And And the issue is exactly as you've described it. There are a lot of parents in the community who don't want their kids to be exposed to a candid discussion about gender or about sexuality because they allege that it's part of some larger agenda to change their kids or to make them more open to and accepting of these alternative lifestyles. And you describe it as progress. You know, we want kids to be exposed to these things because it will make them more open-minded and more inclusive and more accepting of others. The folks who push these bans take the opposite view. They think that these things are abnormal or aberrant and should not be presented as normal to kids. Now, I think the role that children play in this is very interesting. It reminds me of the old, do you ever watch like The Simpsons back when it was funny? I really need to stop asking college students if they get my cultural references because increasingly they don't. But way back in the beginning, the Simpsons featured a character named Reverend Lovejoy, and his wife, Helen, was always like her catchphrase was, "Won't somebody please think of the children?" Because everything was traceable back to the children. And every cause was framed as an effort to protect the children from some threat. And I see that very clearly where censorship and art censorship are concerned, because usually efforts to censor are framed as efforts in defense of vulnerable children's minds. And I think our discussion in class led us to some less interesting places because of the focus on whether or not this or that age group should be able to learn about sexuality, for example. And I think the question becomes more interesting when we limit ourselves to a discussion of consenting adults, you know, age 18 and up, where the question of impressionable young minds is sort of removed from the table. So let me just kind of redirect it there. Do you think that it is ever appropriate for adults to be denied access to film or to visual art or to music or to anything else because its content is bad for them? You know, do we as adults need to be protected from artworks?
I think we should be able to see that stuff. And I feel like if there's a will, there's a way. You could find some illegal website or something like that to view that. And I kind of think, why do we care so much about what's being censored for adults? Like, what's the harm in seeing this, like, graphic stuff?
I think that it's up to the individual. Like, obviously, if you're seeing the trailer and you think that it might have some harm on you or your thinking, I think that then you can just, like, not go see it. But I do think that it's important, for example, in film and television to have a variety of things, because most or some film deals with social issues, and like I've been saying, it just increases diversity of thought, and I can't push that point harder. So I would say that it shouldn't be censored because it increases diversity of thought and it should be up to the individual.
I don't know if we reached anything quite like a consensus in our class on this matter or on any matters so far, but I do think that everyone agrees that at different age levels, it is broadly okay to restrict what kids have access to, whether that means through a rating system for movies and television, or it means teachers making curricular decisions, or even libraries deciding, you know, this book is okay for high school students, but it's not okay for elementary school students. So that's all good. I think the question of whether or not the state or some institution has a right to deny access to adults to make those decisions for themselves is somewhat less clear. It sounded to me like some people thought that censoring things on grounds that they were obscene or pornographic and removing access to people was okay. And other people thought, like, now we're adults, like if we want to consume this media, we should be able to. And if we decide not to, like, that's our prerogative. I think those points are all well taken. We ambled a little bit into the question of whether or not, like, you know, governments should restrict our access to news or to, like, military intelligence and things like that. But at a certain point, that constitutes a tangent from the question about art specifically. having completed this discussion, I mean, what's your takeaway? Did your position on the matter change at all in the course of hashing it out with the class, or do you still feel about this basically the same that you did in the beginning?
I think I kind of feel the same way, because I always thought art's important and we should protect it, and blocking it out from people is bad. And then also the point about children reading books about gay people. If your child reads that, I don't think they're gonna turn gay. I think the only thing that may have changed for me was with the government. I think a lot of things should be protected, mostly military info and stuff like that, because it could be a national security threat.
I think that my belief on art and censorship has kind of stayed the same, but I've gained new and different perspectives. Like Aidan said, I think that when it comes to military censorship, I think that begs more of a question of safety rather than expression.
Aidan and Taylor, thank you for joining me on the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
You have been listening to the Art of Conversation Radio, brought to you by the Aileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University here in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. As always, I am your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. Thank you for joining us today, and enjoy your evening.